during the First World War, which began on the 9th of April and lasted until the 16th of May 1917. British, Canadian, New Zealand, Newfoundland, and Australian troops attacked German defences near the French city of Arras on the Western Front. The British effort was a relatively broad front assault between Vimy in the northwest and Bullecourt in the southeast. This Battle of Arras was part of the wider Nivelle offensive, a plan masterminded by French General Robert Nivelle, which aimed to break the deadlock on the Western Front in 1917. The French army launched an attack a few days later near the River Aisne. Following heavy losses in the fighting on the Somme, the Germans had taken the decision to shorten their lines that required fewer men to hold it. For the preceding 9 months, Russian prisoners and support troops of the German army had been engaged in building a fearsome new defensive position, called by the British the Hindenburg Line. Beginning with local retirements, by the 18th of March 1917 the German army had completed their withdrawal behind this line. This created serious complications for the British, dislocating their battle plans on the eve of the offensive. For the French the problem was even more acute, as their forthcoming attack was intended as a breakout from a salient that no longer existed. However, Nivelle decided to proceed with the attack. The preliminary bombardment of Vimy Ridge started on the 20th of March, and the bombardment of the rest of the sector on the 4th of April. At the Battle of Arras saw German positions pulverized by more than 2.5 million shells, about 1 million more than at the Somme. When troops attacked, they were supported by a creeping barrage. Artillery support was more effective at Arras than at the Somme, thanks in part to improvements in training and scheduling, and the new 106 fuse, which made high explosive shells more reliable. Artillery support was increased to nearly 3,000 guns, a substantial proportion of which were heavies, essential for destroying well-constructed strong points. The Arras offensive has been divided into 10 distinct actions, comprising battles, and flanking, subsidiary and subsequent attacks. The first 2 actions of the first phase, the Battle of Vimy Ridge and the simultaneous First Battle of the Scarpe, took place during the 9th until 14th of April. These are considered to have been a great success for the British and Imperial troops. On the first day of the Battle of Arras, the Canadian Corps made up the bulk of the force that attacked Vimy Ridge. It was the first time that all 4 divisions of the Corps had fought together. The preliminary bombardment lasted several weeks, and mines laid in tunnels dug beneath the ridge were detonated just before the attack. By noon, 3 of the 4 divisions had taken their objectives. They took control of the position at the cost of nearly 10,000 men. The Canadian and British forces of General Horne's First Army were able to eject the German defenders, here and in the attacks south of the ridge made by General Allenby's Third Army. Advances were preceded by a considerable artillery barrage comprising both high explosives and gas. Third Army's attack was so successful initially that advances were made up to a depth of 3 miles. The farthest advance achieved in the west since the advent of trench warfare in 1914. The battle also succeeded in drawing German forces away from the French attack at the Aisne. Further south, the flanking attacks by the Australian and British troops of General Gough's Fifth Army at Bullecourt on the 11th April, and those of the German forces of General von Falkenhorsen's Sixth Army at Lagny-Court 4 days later were both stalemates. After a pause that allowed the rotation of exhausted units, which also allowed German reinforcements to pour into the area, General Allenby's Third Army undertook Phase 3, the Second Battle of the Scar, fought on the 23rd to 24th. Farther north, General Horne's First Army was committed to a subsidiary attack on La Calotte on the 23rd April. Working in conjunction with Third Army, both took part in the Battle of Arras, 28th until 29th April, the much larger fourth phase of the offensive. These attacks and the last three major actions of the battle were successful only insofar as they relieved pressure on the French armies, whose own offensive, begun on the 16th of April, had run into serious trouble. While advances had been made, this was not the knockout blow promised by Nivelle. Casualties were excessive, and the stark contrast between the promises of the French generals and the realities of the fighting caused a collapse in French morale. On 3rd May, the men of the French 2nd Division refused to attack. Many of the units were described as going on strike, or more simply, mutinying. The French army was in real danger of disintegration, and the offensive was abandoned on the 9th May. As the French armies still held over 2/3 of the Western Front, Field Marshal Haig now had to keep pressure on the German forces and so prevent any attack on the badly shaken French. Concern for the Russian front were also growing as news of the revolution began to arrive in the West. The relief of the Allied armies, however, came at the cost of Haig's own troops. Third Army was compelled to fight Phase 5 of the offensive, the Third Battle of the Scar, between the 3rd until the 4th of May, and another major action, the capture of Roux, on the 13th until the 14th of May. Finally, General Gough's Fifth Army undertook a flanking operation, the Battle of Bullecourt, on the 3rd until the 16th of May. With the Battle of Bullecourt, the Arras offensive finally ended. It was noteworthy for the swift and spectacular gains made by the British in the opening phase and the capture of Vimy Ridge, considered virtually impregnable by the Canadian Corps. The battle ended as a costly stalemate resulting in some 300,000 casualties. The French army's struggle in the Nivelle offensive for the Chemin des Dames Ridge resulted in heavy casualties and proved so damaging to the army's morale that there were mutinies. Nivelle's grand promises had ended in disaster and he was replaced by Philippe Pétain.